Subscribe to Cheating Tales Lab. Now let's begin. The sedan's headlights cut through the November darkness at exactly 6:47 p.m. when Brandon Vega's phone rang. He was 3 pages deep into editing a manuscript about corporate fraud when Coach Murray Gomez's name lit up the screen. Mr. Vega, practice ended 20 minutes ago. Is Cassie sick today? Brandon's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. The question made no sense. He'd watched his father-in-law Wilbur Wiggins pull away from the curb with Cassie buckled in the passenger seat at 4:30, her soccer bag bouncing in the back. Wilbur had volunteered that morning over breakfast, insisting he wanted to spend time with his granddaughter. Brandon had hesitated, but his daughter's excited eyes had made the decision for him. Coach, her grandfather drove her. They left here 2 hours ago. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds too long. Nobody's seen her, Mr. Vega. I've been here since 4. Every parent's accounted for except Cassie. Brandon's blood turned to ice water. He ended the call and immediately dialed Wilbur's number. It rang 6 times before hitting voicemail. He tried again and again. By the 7th attempt, his hands were shaking. By the 20th, he'd grabbed his jacket and was heading to his car. The drive to Wilbur's house took 14 minutes that felt like 14 hours. The colonial-style home sat dark and empty on Maple Drive, Wilbur's car absent from the driveway. Brandon used the spare key his late wife Terry had given him years ago. The house smelled of old coffee and something else, something chemical he couldn't place. His journalist instincts, honed over 15 years of investigative work, kicked into overdrive. Wilbur's study was immaculate as always. Too immaculate. The man was 72 and lived alone since Terry's death 3 years ago, yet there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. Brandon opened drawers methodically, searching for anything that might explain where his daughter was. Bank statements, utility bills, old photographs. Nothing unusual until he reached the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk. It was locked. Brandon had learned to pick locks during an investigation into a human trafficking ring back in his reporting days. The skill hadn't faded. 30 seconds later, the drawer slid open to reveal a burner phone and a leather-bound journal. The phone was dead. The journal made his stomach drop. The entries dated back 6 months. Wilbur's handwriting, usually neat and measured, grew increasingly erratic with each page. Names Brandon didn't recognize. Addresses in neighboring states. Dollar amounts that made no sense for a retired postal worker's finances. And then, 3 weeks ago, a single line that made everything click into place. Brandon's getting too close. The girl might be the only leverage. His daughter wasn't just missing. She was leverage. Brandon's mind raced backward through the past 6 months. The pharmaceutical expose he'd been researching. The interviews with whistleblowers. The threats that started appearing in his email. The brake line on his car that mysteriously failed 2 months ago. He'd attributed it to coincidence, to paranoia. Now he understood. Wilbur wasn't just Terry's father. He was involved in something far darker, something Brandon's investigation had apparently threatened. Call 47 went to voicemail at 11:53 p.m. Brandon sat in his living room, every light blazing, his laptop open to encrypted files he'd compiled on a company called Meridian Health Solutions. The pharmaceutical giant had been systematically testing unapproved drugs on vulnerable populations in rural communities. Brandon had the testimony of 6 former employees, medical records he'd obtained through confidential sources, and a paper trail that led directly to 3 executives. What he didn't have was the smoking gun, the absolute proof that would make the story bulletproof. He also didn't have his daughter. At midnight exactly, the doorbell rang. Brandon was on his feet before the second chime, his hand instinctively reaching for the baseball bat he kept by the door. He looked through the peephole, and his heart nearly stopped. Cassie stood on the porch alone, her small frame trembling in the November cold. She wore her purple soccer uniform, but her feet were bare and dirty. Her face was streaked with tears and something dark. Blood. It covered her hands, her shirt, matted in her dark hair that matched Brandon's own. He ripped the door open and pulled her inside, checking her for injuries even as she collapsed against him. Are you hurt? Cassie, baby, are you hurt? She shook her head mutely, her 8-year-old body shaking so violently her teeth chattered. No visible wounds despite the blood. Relief and terror warred in Brandon's chest. If the blood wasn't hers, whose was it? Grandpa, she finally whispered, her voice raw from crying. Grandpa said give you this when I got home. She pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. Brandon held her tight with one arm while opening it with the other. The message was typed, not handwritten, each word a nail in his coffin. You have 24 hours to destroy every file, every backup, every piece of evidence related to Meridian. Tell no one. Involve no police. After tonight, you'll understand what we're capable of. The blood on your daughter isn't hers. It belonged to Dr. Edgar Underwood. He talked to you last week. He won't be talking to anyone again. This is your only warning. Your daughter is alive because we allow it. Defy US and she becomes the next message. You have until tomorrow midnight. Dr. Edgar Underwood. The whistleblower who'd given Brandon the internal memos, the clinical trial data showing Meridian had knowingly distributed a drug that caused fatal heart arrhythmias. A good man with a conscience who'd risked everything to expose the truth. Now he was dead, and they'd used his blood to paint a message on Brandon's 8-year-old daughter. Cassie was sobbing against his chest. I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm sorry. Grandpa took me to a big building, and there was a man, and they made me watch, and there was so much blood, and Grandpa said you'd been bad, and you had to stop, or they'd hurt me, and I'm scared. Daddy, I'm so scared. Show, baby. It's okay. You're safe now. You're safe. The lies tasted like ash in his mouth. She wasn't safe. Neither of them were safe. Not while Wilbur and whoever he worked for drew breath. Brandon carried Cassie upstairs, getting her cleaned up and into fresh clothes while his mind worked through scenarios at lightning speed. They knew where he lived. They knew about his investigation. They had his father-in-law, which meant they'd had access to his life for who knew how long. Wilbur had been at family dinners, had babysat Cassie, had probably reported back every detail of Brandon's movements. The betrayal would have cut deeper if Brandon hadn't learned long ago that everyone had a price. Clearly, Meridian had found Wilbur's. He tucked Cassie into bed, her hand gripping his so tight her knuckles went white. Don't leave me. Never. I promise. He sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing evened out into exhausted sleep, then returned downstairs to make preparations. 24 hours. They expected him to fold, to destroy 3 months of meticulous investigative work, to let them get away with poisoning people for profit. They expected fear to override his principles. They'd made a fatal miscalculation. Brandon had spent 15 years exposing monsters who thought themselves untouchable. He'd taken down corrupt politicians, organized crime figures, corporate executives who played God with people's lives. He'd done it with nothing but a laptop, determination, and a willingness to go places others wouldn't. His wife Terry had loved that about him once, before the threat started, before she'd asked him to stop, to think about their daughter's safety. Then a drunk driver had taken Terry 3 years ago, and Brandon had promised himself he'd never let fear dictate his choices again. He'd been careful, strategic, kept his work separate from his home life. He'd thought Cassie was safe. Tonight had proven that delusion wrong, but it had also proven something else. They were scared. Scared enough to break cover, to reveal Wilbur's involvement, to commit murder. That meant Brandon was close to something that could destroy them. The evidence he'd gathered wasn't just damaging, it was catastrophic. He opened his laptop and began working. Not to destroy files, but to copy them. Every document, every interview recording, every piece of evidence went onto 3 separate encrypted drives. He packaged them carefully, addressed them to 3 different investigative journalists he trusted, people who'd worked with him before and understood the stakes. At 2 a.m., he made a single phone call to Lloyd Blevins, an old colleague who'd left journalism to work in private security. Not the corporate kind, the kind that asked no questions and owed no allegiances except to the paycheck. Brandon, it's been a while. I need a favor. Actually, I need several. The dangerous kind. My favorite kind. Talk to me. Brandon explained the situation in clipped sentences. Lloyd listened without interruption, a skill that made him invaluable. When Brandon finished, there was a pause. You're not planning to run, are you? I'm planning to disappear. Temporarily. Smart. What do you need? A clean car. Cash. 2 fake IDs. Good ones. One for me and one for my daughter. And information on anyone connected to Meridian Health Solutions Executive Board, particularly anyone with ties to organized crime or private military contractors. The IDs will take until morning. Everything else I can have in 3 hours. Make it 2. And Lloyd, if something happens to me, those packages I'm sending out need to be published. All of them. Understood. Stay alive, Brandon. You're one of the good ones. Brandon ended the call and looked at the 3 packages ready for courier pickup. Tomorrow morning, they'd be scattered across the country, insurance against his permanent silence. But insurance wasn't enough. He needed to go on offense. He pulled up everything he'd compiled on Meridian's executive structure. CEO Lorenzo Williams, a charismatic figurehead with a spotless public record. CFO Marcelino Chandler, the money man with connections to offshore accounts. And COO Gonzalo Hawkins, the operations chief who'd joined the company 8 months ago from a private military contracting firm. Hawkins. That was the linchpin. Brandon dug deeper, using databases he'd cultivated over years of investigative work. Hawkins had a history. Blackwater, then Triple Canopy, then a series of shell companies in conflict zones where accountability went to die. He specialized in making problems disappear. People problems. Meridian hadn't just hired an operations chief. They'd hired a professional fixer. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Wilbur's involvement, the timing, the brutality of Dr. Underwood's murder. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. This was a criminal enterprise using a pharmaceutical company as cover, willing to kill to protect their profits. And Brandon had just become their biggest threat. He spent the next hour creating a digital dead man's switch. If he didn't check in every 12 hours with a specific code, the files would automatically upload to WikiLeaks, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 6 other major outlets. It wasn't perfect, but it bought him leverage. At 4 a.m., Lloyd arrived with a nondescript Honda Civic, $50,000 in cash, and 2 Virginia driver's licenses that showed a father and daughter named Morgan and Alice Graves. The photos were recent, professional, perfect. The IDs will hold up to everything except federal scrutiny, Lloyd said, handing over the documents. Where are you headed? Better you don't know. Fair enough. One more thing. He passed Brandon a smartphone. Encrypted. Untraceable. My number's already programmed. You need an exit strategy or backup, you call. Brandon pocketed the phone. What do I owe you? We'll call it even for the time I was pinned down in Kandahar and you ran through mortar fire to drag my ass to cover. Some debts don't get paid in cash. They shook hands, and Lloyd disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Brandon went upstairs and gently woke Cassie. Baby, we need to go on a trip. Right now. Her eyes went wide with fear. Are the bad people coming back? Not if I can help it. But we need to be smart, and we need to be fast. Can you do that for me? She nodded, her jaw set with determination that broke his heart. 8 years old, and she'd already learned the world wasn't safe. He packed 2 bags in under 10 minutes, grabbed the encrypted drives and the cash, and loaded everything into the Civic. The sun was just starting to paint the eastern sky orange when they pulled out of the driveway. Brandon took one last look at the house in the rearview mirror, the home he'd shared with Terry, where Cassie had taken her first steps, where they'd been happy once. Then he turned his eyes forward and drove. The highway stretched empty and infinite as Brandon pushed the Civic north toward the Pennsylvania border. Cassie slept in the passenger seat, exhausted from trauma and tears, her small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of childhood innocence that life was rapidly stripping away. Every mile put distance between them and immediate danger, but distance wasn't safety. Not yet. Brandon's mind replayed the previous night on an endless loop, analyzing every detail for meaning. Wilbur's betrayal cut deeper than he wanted to admit. The man had dandled Cassie on his knee as a baby, had taught her to ride a bicycle, had been the grandfather figure she deserved after Terry died. 3 years of trust, obliterated in one night. But the betrayal also revealed weakness in their organization. Wilbur was a reluctant participant. That much was clear from his journal entries. The girl might be the only leverage, suggested desperation, not conviction. They'd recruited him, probably with threats or money or both, and used his access to Brandon's life. That meant their intelligence wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. They needed human assets, informants. That was an exploitable vulnerability. At a truck stop outside Harrisburg, Brandon used the encrypted phone to check news reports. Nothing yet about Dr. Edgar Underwood. The body hadn't been discovered, or more likely, it had been disappeared completely. Meridian's fixer was thorough. He pulled up the dead man's switch interface and entered the 12-hour code. The timer reset. 12 more hours of insurance. He'd need to maintain that rhythm religiously. Cassie stirred awake as they crossed into Pennsylvania. Where are we going, Daddy? Somewhere safe. Away from the people who scared you. What about Grandpa? Her voice was small, uncertain. Brandon's hands tightened on the steering wheel. How did you explain betrayal to an 8-year-old? How did you tell her that the man she loved had sold them out to murderers? Grandpa made some bad choices, baby. He got involved with bad people and did bad things. We can't see him anymore. Did he want to hurt me? The question pierced straight through Brandon's heart. I don't know, but I won't let him get the chance. I promise you that. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the passing landscape. The man they hurt. Dr. Underwood. He seemed nice when I met him. Before. Brandon's head snapped toward her. You met him before last night. Uh-huh. At Grandpa's house 2 weeks ago. He came to talk to Grandpa, and they argued. Dr. Underwood kept saying he was going to tell someone about the bad medicine, and Grandpa said he couldn't, that it would ruin everything. I was supposed to be asleep, but I heard them. New information clicked into place. Wilbur hadn't just been reporting on Brandon's investigation. He'd been actively trying to intimidate sources. Dr. Underwood had gone to him, probably thinking Terry's father might be sympathetic, might help convince Brandon to escalate the story. Instead, he'd walked into a trap. What else do you remember about that night, sweetie? Take your time. Cassie's brow furrowed in concentration. There were 2 other men there too. One was really tall with gray hair and a scar on his face. The other one was younger and scary. He didn't talk much, but when he did, everyone got quiet. Gray hair and a scar. That could be anyone. But the description of authority, of fear, that matched what Brandon knew about Gonzalo Hawkins. The fixer had been at Wilbur's house, which meant Wilbur was more than just an informant. He was part of their inner circle. That changed the equation. Brandon pulled off at the next exit and found a quiet motel, the kind that accepted cash and didn't look too closely at IDs. He registered them as Morgan and Alice Graves, paid for 3 nights up front, and parked the Civic behind the building where it couldn't be seen from the road. The room smelled of disinfectant and desperation, but it had 2 beds and a deadbolt. Brandon checked every window, every possible entry point, then pulled the curtains tight. Cassie sat on one of the beds, looking smaller than her 8 years. Are we hiding? For now, but not forever. What happens when they find us? Brandon sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. They're not going to find us, baby. Because we're going to be smarter than them. And when the time is right, we're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone ever again. How? Good question. The evidence he'd compiled would expose Meridian's crimes, but evidence alone didn't stop men like Hawkins. Men who murdered whistleblowers and terrorized children didn't care about indictments or trials. They operated in the shadows where law and morality held no sway. To stop them, Brandon would need to drag them into the light in a way they couldn't escape. He'd need to turn their own tactics against them, make them vulnerable, expose not just their crimes but the entire structure that protected them. He'd need to become the monster they feared. I'm going to tell their story, he said simply. The whole truth, in a way that everyone will see. And when I'm done, the bad people will have nowhere left to hide. Cassie seemed satisfied with that answer. She turned on the television, finding a Cartoon Network, and for a few blessed minutes, Brandon let himself believe they could have normalcy again. His encrypted phone buzzed. A message from Lloyd. Your packages were picked up. All 3 are in transit. Also, someone visited your house an hour ago. 3 men, professional-grade hardware. They left when they realized you were gone. Tread carefully. So Meridian knew he'd run. That meant the 24-hour deadline was meaningless, a psychological weapon they'd never intended to honor. They'd planned to kill him regardless, probably make it look like a murder-suicide after he'd killed his own daughter in a breakdown. Clean, tragic, case closed. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it crystallized his resolve. Brandon opened his laptop and began writing. Not the careful, measured prose of an investigative journalist, but something rawer, more visceral. He started with Dr. Edgar Underwood's murder, describing in brutal detail what his daughter had witnessed. He named names: Wilbur Wiggins, Gonzalo Hawkins, Lorenzo Williams, Marcelino Chandler. He laid out the pharmaceutical trials, the deaths, the cover-ups. But he also did something more strategic. He embedded information that only the inner circle would recognize, specific details that would make them question who else might be talking. Code names from Wilbur's journal, meeting locations, dollar amounts that didn't appear in any official records. He created paranoia, the sense that their organization was hemorrhaging secrets from multiple sources. Then he saved it as a draft and set up an automated publication sequence. If he didn't stop it with a specific code, the article would post in 72 hours to every major news outlet and social media platform he could access. It was bait and insurance wrapped in one package. While Cassie watched cartoons, Brandon made a series of calls on the encrypted phone. First to Rebecca Morgan, an investigative producer at 60 Minutes who'd worked with him on a story about military contractor fraud. She listened to his 30-second pitch and agreed to start preliminary research immediately. Second to Hong Arnold, a data analyst who specialized in forensic accounting. Brandon needed Meridian's money trail mapped in detail, every shell company and offshore account exposed. Third to a number he'd sworn never to use again, Salvatore Zavala. Salvatore answered on the first ring. I wondered when you'd call. I need information on a man named Gonzalo Hawkins, the Meridian fixer. Yeah, I know him. Worked with him briefly in Afghanistan. He's very good at making problems disappear. Any weaknesses? Salvatore laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. Everyone has weaknesses, Brandon. His is ego. He thinks he's untouchable because he's gotten away with it for 20 years. Makes him sloppy when he feels secure. How do I make him feel secure while building a trap? You give him a target he can't resist. Something that looks vulnerable, but is actually bait. Classic honeypot, except instead of sex, you use ego and greed. They talked for 20 minutes, Salvatore outlining a strategy that was as brilliant as it was dangerous. By the time Brandon hung up, he had the skeleton of a plan that could work if he was willing to take enormous risks. He was. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Brandon worked 18-hour days while Cassie colored in activity books and slowly started to smile again. He built firewalls of information, created false trails, and laid the groundwork for what would either be his masterpiece or his funeral. Hong Arnold came back with financial data that was devastating. Meridian had funneled over $400 million through shell companies into numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands over 3 years. The money corresponded exactly with clinical trial dates, suggesting systematic fraud on a massive scale. Rebecca Morgan obtained internal communications that showed executives knew about the drug's fatal side effects 18 months before pulling it from the market. They'd decided the potential lawsuits were cheaper than halting production. Each piece of evidence was a nail in Meridian's coffin. But nails didn't matter if the coffin never closed. On the fourth day, Brandon made the call that would either save them or doom them. He used a burner phone purchased with cash, routing it through 3 different networks to obscure the origin. Gonzalo Hawkins answered personally. This is unexpected. You wanted me to destroy my evidence. I'm ready to negotiate. A pause. You have my attention. Face to face. Neutral location. I bring my daughter. You bring Wilbur Wiggins. We make a trade. Evidence for our safety. You're not in a position to negotiate terms, Mr. Vega. I am when I have dead man switches pointed at every media outlet in the country. If I don't check in every 12 hours, everything goes public. Names, dates, transactions, bodies. All of it. Another pause, longer this time. What guarantee do I have you'll honor this agreement? The same guarantee I have that you won't kill us. None. But we both have incentives to make this work. You get your evidence and your silence. I get to raise my daughter in peace. Where and when? Brandon named a location 3 hours south, an abandoned industrial complex outside Philadelphia that Salvatore had scouted. Multiple exits, high visibility, perfect for what he had planned. Tomorrow night, 10 p.m. You, Wilbur, and no one else. Agreed. But Mr. Vega, if you're lying, if this is a setup, I'll make sure your daughter watches you die slowly before I finish her. The line went dead. Cassie looked up from her coloring book. Was that the bad man? Yes, baby. But not for much longer. Are we really going to give him your evidence? Brandon knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. No, sweetheart. We're going to give him exactly what he deserves. And when it's over, we're going to make sure he can never hurt anyone again. She studied his face with the unnerving perception children sometimes possess. You're scared. Terrified. But being scared doesn't mean we don't do what's right. Your mother taught me that. I miss Mommy. Me too. Every day. But she'd be proud of how brave you've been. And tomorrow, we're going to make her proud again. That night, Brandon made his preparations. He reviewed the plan with Salvatore one final time, confirmed positioning with Lloyd, who'd brought in 3 more operators, and briefed Rebecca Morgan on the timing for the story's release. Everything had to align perfectly, or it would all fall apart. At dawn, he woke Cassie and they hit the road. The drive south felt both endless and too brief, every mile bringing them closer to confrontation. Brandon rehearsed scenarios in his head, wargaming outcomes, preparing for contingencies. The abandoned industrial complex came into view at 9:30 p.m. It had been a steel mill once, before globalization had hollowed out American manufacturing. Now it stood as a monument to economic decay, 5 buildings connected by rusted walkways and broken dreams. Perfect for an ending. Brandon parked the Civic and pulled Cassie close. Listen very carefully, baby. When we go inside, you're going to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. No matter what you see or hear. Understand? She nodded, her jaw set with determination. If something goes wrong, if I tell you to run, you run to the car. Keys are in the ignition. You drive to the McDonald's we passed 2 miles back and you call the number I wrote down. Lloyd will come get you. I can't drive, Daddy. I'm 8. You can sit on the front seat and steer and reach the pedals if you're brave enough. And you're the bravest person I know. They walked hand in hand into the largest building, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Moonlight streamed through broken windows, casting shadows that moved like living things. At exactly 10 p.m., headlights appeared at the far entrance. Gonzalo Hawkins stepped out first, moving with the controlled grace of a predator. He was 52, but looked younger, all lean muscle and cold calculation. Behind him came Wilbur Wiggins, looking like he'd aged a decade in 4 days. Brandon felt Cassie's hand tighten in his. Wilbur wouldn't meet her eyes. Mr. Vega, Hawkins said, his voice carrying easily across the empty space. Punctual. I appreciate that in a man. Let's skip the pleasantries. You want the evidence, I want guarantees. Show me what you have. Brandon held up a USB drive. Every file, every recording, every piece of documentation. The original Deadman switches are already disabled. This is the master copy. How do I know it's real? You don't. But you know I'm not stupid enough to come here without the real thing. Check it if you want. I've got time. Hawkins gestured, and Wilbur shuffled forward. Brandon's former father-in-law looked broken, hollowed out. When he finally met Brandon's eyes, there was something that might have been remorse. I'm sorry, Wilbur whispered. They said they'd kill me. Said they'd kill Cassie. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice, Brandon said coldly. You made yours. Wilbur took the USB drive with shaking hands and walked back to Hawkins, who plugged it into a laptop. For 3 agonizing minutes, he reviewed files while Brandon's heart hammered against his ribs. Everything depended on the next 60 seconds. Finally, Hawkins looked up. This appears to be everything. However, Mr. Vega, we both know I can't let you walk away. You're too dangerous, too principled. You'll start investigating again the moment you feel safe. I figured you'd say that. Brandon pulled Cassie behind him as Hawkins drew a pistol from his jacket. But instead of pointing it at Brandon, he turned it on Wilbur Wiggins. Loose ends, Hawkins said almost apologetically before pulling the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Wilbur crumpled, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. Cassie screamed. Brandon's entire plan hung in the balance. Then the lights came on. Every shadow in the building evaporated as industrial floods burst to life. Lloyd and his team emerged from concealed positions, weapons trained on Hawkins. But more importantly, 4 television cameras had just captured everything in high definition. Rebecca Morgan stepped out from behind a camera, her press credentials clearly visible. Gonzalo Hawkins, I'm Rebecca Morgan from 60 Minutes. We're broadcasting live. The entire country just watched you murder a man in cold blood. Would you care to comment? Hawkins's face went from confident to panicked in one heartbeat. He looked at his gun, at the cameras, at the operators surrounding him. The math was simple and devastating. He was done. You set me up, he said to Brandon, his voice flat with realization. I gave you exactly what you wanted, Brandon replied. A vulnerable target, false evidence, and the illusion of control. You got sloppy because you felt secure. Just like Salvatore said you would. The USB drive didn't contain evidence of Brandon's investigation. It contained fabricated documents designed to look real under cursory inspection. The real evidence was already in the hands of federal prosecutors, delivered by courier that morning. The meeting had never been about trading evidence. It was about getting Hawkins on camera committing murder while simultaneously confessing to Brandon's allegations. The trap had worked perfectly. Federal agents swarmed in from outside, dozens of them, weapons drawn. Later, Brandon would learn that Rebecca's broadcast had included not just the murder, but a comprehensive expose of Meridian Health Solutions crimes. The evidence Arnold compiled, the testimony of Dr. Underwood's colleagues, the internal communications Rebecca obtained. All of it, broadcast to 20 million viewers in real time. Hawkins was taken into custody without a fight. Medical teams rushed to Wilbur, but there was nothing to be done. He died on the cold concrete floor of an abandoned steel mill, a victim of the very organization he'd served. Brandon pulled Cassie close, shielding her eyes from the carnage. Lloyd approached, giving him a subtle nod. Clean operation. The girl okay? Brandon looked down at his daughter. She was trembling, but her eyes were clear and focused. She's strong. Stronger than any of us. Over the next 3 weeks, the dominoes fell with satisfying precision. Lorenzo Williams and Marcelino Chandler were arrested within 48 hours. Federal prosecutors found enough evidence to charge them with fraud, murder conspiracy, and a dozen other counts. The Meridian Health Solutions stock price plummeted to zero. The company filed for bankruptcy protection within a week. Brandon and Cassie stayed in protective custody during the initial chaos, then transitioned to a safe house in Montana while the trials played out. He worked remotely, writing a book about the investigation that would become a bestseller. Cassie started therapy, processing the trauma with a psychologist who specialized in childhood PTSD. Slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild. 6 months later, on a warm June morning, Brandon and Cassie stood at Terry's grave. They'd returned to their hometown for the first time since that November night, ready to reclaim their lives. "Do you think Mommy would be proud?" Cassie asked, placing flowers on the headstone. Brandon thought about Terry, about her fierce commitment to doing what was right regardless of cost. "Yeah, baby. I think she'd be very proud of both of us." "What about Grandpa?" That was harder. Wilbur had betrayed them, but he'd also been family once. "I think Grandpa got lost. Made bad choices that led him somewhere dark. But in the end, maybe he helped us by showing us who the real enemies were." "That's generous. Your mother taught me that too. Forgiveness, even when it's hard." They stood in silence for a few minutes, remembering. Then Cassie tugged his hand. "Can we go home now?" "Real home?" "Yeah, we can go home." The house on Maple Drive looked the same, but felt different. Brandon had hired a service to clean it thoroughly, removing any trace of that terrible night. They spent the afternoon unpacking, claiming space, making it theirs again. That evening, Brandon received a call from the federal prosecutor. The trials had concluded. Hawkins had been sentenced to life without parole. Williams and Chandler got 25 years each. Over 30 other individuals connected to Meridian's crimes had been indicted. Justice, imperfect but real. Brandon made dinner while Cassie did homework at the kitchen table, the normalcy almost surreal after months of chaos. They ate spaghetti and talked about school, about soccer, about the things that mattered to an 8-year-old girl trying to reclaim her childhood. Later, after tucking Cassie into bed, Brandon sat in his study and opened his laptop. New investigation folders waited, new stories that needed telling. Corruption didn't end with Meridian's fall. There would always be another monster, another truth that needed exposing. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. He'd protected his daughter, exposed the truth, and brought down an organization that thought itself untouchable. Not through violence or revenge, but through the power of information and the courage to use it wisely. Cassie appeared in the doorway, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight. "Bad dream. Can I sleep with you tonight?" "Always." They settled into Brandon's bed together. Cassie curled against his side like she used to when she was younger. "Daddy, are we safe now?" Brandon thought about all the ways he could answer that question. The truth was messy, complicated. Bad people still existed. Danger would always lurk somewhere in the shadows. But they were smarter now, stronger, ready for whatever came next. "We're as safe as I can make us," he said finally. "And I promise, I'll always fight to keep you that way. I know. You're the bravest person I know." He smiled, kissing the top of her head. "I learned it from you, baby." Outside, the neighborhood settled into quiet darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new battles against injustice. But tonight, in this moment, Brandon Vega held his daughter close and let himself believe that despite everything, the good guys could still win. They just had to be smart enough, brave enough, and willing to fight for what mattered most. And Brandon had proven he was all three. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.